Many believe too many historical occurrences, figures, and concepts have been recently boycotted and spurned from contemporary society. British author, social critic, and uncancelled history podcast host Douglas Murray reevaluates these great figures in the context of their times.
Decolonizing Curricula, which consists of stripping out authors from the past. The attempted cancellation not just of one figure, but of a whole range of figures. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, the great classical philosophers who formed the foundation of Western thought. We're going to be discussing the attempt to eradicate the whole Western canon, including some of the philosophers of the Enlightenment. The reason this discussion matters is because the attempt to destroy, cancel the Western classical tradition, including the classical tradition of philosophy, arguably leaves the West without some of its most important foundations. Take away Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, the Enlightenment. You take away the very foundations of free thought, free inquiry, rationalism, and so much more. That's why the attempt to cancel the classics matters today as much as ever. And I'm delighted to be joined in this discussion by writer Thomas Chatterton Williams. Saving classics from identity politics.
There was something in these books that transcended whatever society was telling about particularized identity and put in conversation with something universal and something transcendent and something uplifting. And so reading and thinking of yourself as someone who participates in this wider, universal, humanistic culture. Now we have this reevaluation of these ancient figures and the Western tradition itself as being inherently what is in today's parlance called, or as being emblems of whiteness and that are necessarily exclusive. We know that Athenians didn't look around and say, we're all a bunch of white people here. They said, no, I'm an Athenian. And if you're in the next city-state, you're a barbarian. They didn't say we've all got similar epidermises. That wasn't how they thought of themselves. So it's a revision of, it's looking at the past through the prism of the present in a very specific way of thinking about identity.
There seems to be, in our time, this very clear attempt to war on these origin figures, on the central figures who provided philosophical underpinnings of our societies. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. And this war on these people has consequences. This sort of thinking is a direct consequence of this assault on a war against foundational figures like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. Because if you do away with all of that, you end up in this place where you have to talk about other virtues. So the classics lay out an interpretation of virtues, the things you should have in your life, the things you should aspire to, including critical thought, reasoning, and much more. It creates a dichotomy where they say white people have this white supremacist culture where they worship the written word. In 300 BC, everybody was excluding some people from civic life. There wasn't much by way of civic life as we would now.
The breakthrough in Athens was that anybody was participating in any kind of democratic way of civic life. That was the breakthrough, was that some people did this. But the idea that most people did that is extraordinarily recent.
This other charge against Aristotle, that he envisioned a hierarchical society. It's an extraordinary form of context collapse, because of course hierarchies existed, they exist now, but of course they were in Aristotle's mind, they were in everybody's mind, in a time when what we now regard as the most basic provisions of life were absent for most people. Described rightly as the certain narcissism of the current age, where we look back at the past and we scour it for things that they were thinking which we don't now think, and therefore you throw it out?
The thing that's really dispiriting is this need for really not complex figures. So this idea that thinking in any way that is no longer the way we think means that you're completely disqualified and therefore no longer has the other redeeming qualities of his art that we should probably still be paying attention to, somebody that's no longer relevant. The idea that Aristotle had to be absolutely aligned with what we believe is right think now on every question means that we can't hold two ideas in our head at once, which is that he got a lot right. And we still basically understand drama in the way that he laid out. He may have actually justified slavery. That also wasn't distinguishing for him at the time in that part of the world.
The opposite would have been highly distinguishing.
Would have been highly distinguishing. But we still have a sense of narrative that he laid out for us. It holds up. I just find the lack of willingness to think of people as fundamentally complicated and contradictory even is a kind of sign of the moral immaturity of the current moment. It extends to the authors of this society. Most of them were not morally superior to their time by certain measures, but who of us is? Future generations are going to think things that we do that we think are quite normal with are monstrous. You know that's coming. All of these things are going to look to future generations as monstrous. It's a weird thing to do to expect everybody to be morally superior to their age.
Slightly odd thing always, in my view, to expect that writers are going to be ethically more pure than other people.
Right.
Including philosophers. It's a pleasant idea, but what you're after there is a sage or a priest, not a philosopher or a writer. You're after a perfect ethical figure.
That's the strange thing about canceling people from the past, because the things that they said that are so objectionable or did, those are dug up. And the things that we encounter them through are them at their best and are probably things that we should hold on to.
What were these philosophers actually trying to do in their day? There must be some way to tilt our heads, to nod and to thank people for those things, whilst in the round recognizing as well that they are going to have views which, years later, we're not going to share.
Progress is not that everybody has to be retroactively held to the standards of the current day. Progress is that you build on the best of what's been thought and acted and enacted from the past, and you take it a bit further. They pass the baton. It's very strange to me that we don't just intuit that people from previous eras were working with different frameworks and that we ourselves are complicated. We give ourselves quite a lot of leeway. We know that we mess up and we are not correct on every question. And we say that we understand we're trying, but we don't extend that generosity. I've been really surprised by how puritanical the moment has become. And not to keep saying the same thing, but I think that it really does matter that the things that we're scandalized by are things that have to be dug up. There's this kind of scouring of the past, looking for things to get upset over.
Mankind operates in a fog. We stumble along a path. We create our path as we go along it. When we look back, we see the man, we see the path, but we don't see the fog. Everything seems obvious once you've got there because you're here. We're here. And we're here because things happened. All of which seem obvious to us.
It's a narcissism, and it's a kind of not extending the kind of generosity to the past that you take for granted for yourself in the present, kind of infantilized way of thinking about things. I think that what we are starving for in the era of social media is more moral complexity, more moral ambiguity, and the tolerance for that, the ability to live outside of binaries and black and white visions of good and bad, Manichaean ways of organizing who's worth listening to and who's not.
Decolonizing Curricula, which consists of stripping out white authors from the past, whether or not they've said things that we don't agree with now. There was a school somewhere in America where the students had taken it upon themselves to decolonize the library.
You're not going to end up with many books that way, because the reality is you can't make the past different. You have to face the fact that for a long time, white men published more than non-white men and white women. Much of what has stood the test of time coming from Europe and then America through a way of organizing society happens to have been done by white men. To get rid of all of that would be to get rid of a lot of what has been published and what has stood the test of time. That was the past. That's how society comes to us. To decolonize the library is to get rid of most of the books and then to fill it up with stuff that's been written quite recently.
Well, that's one thing which exacerbates the narcissistic trend of our era, which is because if we tried to pretend that history started with us, that sort of thinking has been coming in, that we know more than Plato because we live after him. We know more than Aristotle and Socrates because we live after them.
Yeah, that's the kind of hubris of contemporary knowledge. You know that the forms don't exist in the sky the way Plato thought they did. The perfect table, there's a form of that. But you see the way that he thought, and you trace that up through Hegel. You trace it all the way to the current moment. You see how people arrived at the knowledge we have now. And if you have any humility, you know that there's somebody waiting down the line from where you are that's going to think that things you took for granted are actually quite mistaken. There's a bias of the present moment that I think that we're really stuck in morally, but also intellectually.
I find it rather touching when you read somebody you think of as a great classic writer you read who believed something that we now think, how could you possibly believe that? And also, it comes back to this point of humility. If you know that people in the past were like that, then you get the opportunity to think, well, a much more important ethical, moral exercise for us is everybody else in the past believed strange and bizarre things, and some things which we now look back at and think, how did you do that? And an interesting question is, well, then what are the things we're doing that future generations will say, what were they?
It's bizarre to think that everything's been sorted now.
This is one of the things that I think is fundamentally so troubling about this thing of taking down Socrates, taking down Aristotle, taking down Plato. You're just going to wing it? You don't want any of these guys to help? You don't want any of the guidance they could offer? You mentioned that the need for a coalition of people across political, racial, and other boundaries to reject this way of thinking.
You're right. I'm asking for a coalition of people who are good faith, well-meaning, to reject the kind of identity categories that we are socialized to believe are the most important and that define us and that cannot be transcended. I'm really asking for something that a lot of people think is naive. If you really want to move beyond racism, don't just oppose racism, but actually imagine a future in which race is transcended.
I'm Mark Vinette, and I hope you're enjoying the ride.